right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Knijndijk. I am a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. It is a real pleasure to welcome you here today for, we hope will be a really interesting and lively panel on the future of cash transfer programming, which, as everyone in this room knows, is a really vibrant, dynamic, and growing area of humanitarian response. But also, as it's coming into its own within the sector, it's proving a difficult and controversial one. It's challenging the sector. It's challenging some of the divisions of labor that the humanitarian world has traditionally relied upon. And so we have a really great panel here today to talk about the future of cash within the humanitarian field and how the players in that field are tackling some of those challenges. I'll introduce the panelists in just a moment, but first I want to set this up with a thought exercise that Jan Egeland has used. So Jan Egeland, you all know, is a former head of the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. He's now the head of Norwegian Refugee Council. And he served on the high-level panel on cash transfers a few years ago. That was a really seminal report in helping to spur forward the cash as a tool within the humanitarian sector. And in the foreword to the report that Lynn will be launching this morning on the state of the world's cash, Jan says, you know, when I was on that panel, the challenge, he says, he had in the back of his mind is if you imagine that you and your young child and your elderly parents are fleeing into a displacement camp, you left behind everything that you had, and you're asked a question: would you like to receive boxes containing what we think you need as an aid agency, or would you like to receive cash and decide for yourself? What would you choose? And he says, personally, I would choose unconditional cash and decide for myself. And I think that's a useful thought exercise. It's a useful thing for us to keep in the backs of our minds as we think about the merits of cash versus other tools. But it also really underscores why cash is potentially so radical and transformative, in that it takes the power, it takes the decision-making power around humanitarian aid out of the hands of donors, out of the hands of the delivering aid agencies, and puts it much more into the hands of the end users of that aid, the population receiving the assistance. And they may or may not choose to do things with that aid or to meet needs or set priorities with that aid that we in the traditional humanitarian delivery side would have identified ourselves. And so it really begins to challenge, as cash scales up, that really begins to challenge some of the more fundamental arrangements that have underpinned the humanitarian sector really for decades. And as cash now moves out of its startup phase, as it goes, Radha's going to talk to us later about some of IRC's experiences with trying to reach a 25% target for cash delivery in all of their aid programs. That it begins to reach a scale where some of those challenges are coming to a head. And so we have a fantastic panel to talk about all these issues here today. On the far, your far left, my far right, is Lynn Yoshikawa. She is the U.S. representative for the Cash Learning Partnership, which is an alliance of, I think at this point, most of the major donors and implementers of cash transfer programming. So she will be launching and talking about the recently published State of the World's Cash report that the Cash Learning Partnership has published this year. Next, we will turn to my former colleague, Danielle Mouton-Smith from USAID's Food for Peace office, who will talk about some of USAID's work in this area and hopefully tell us a little bit about how some of the looming reforms and changes at USAID could affect this. And finally, we have Radha Rajkotia. Did I say that right?
Well done.
Thank you. From the International Rescue Committee, who will talk to us about, IRC has been one of the most forward-leaning NGOs in trying to advance cash programming and integrate that into their work in a really fundamental way and transformative way. And she's going to talk to us about some of IRC's experiences and recent learnings on that front. So it's my real pleasure to host these very smart people to talk about this today, and I'll turn it over first to Lynn to walk us through some of the findings from CALP's report.
Great, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the Center for Global Development for hosting this event for us. Now, as Jeremy mentioned, in recent years, there has been quite a lot of buzz around cash. And so about a year ago, for CALP, we decided to take stock and to keep building the momentum around cash, to understand kind of what opportunities and challenges still exist and what we need to kind of tackle head on as well. We partnered with Accenture Development Partnerships, who I think hopefully are in the room today as well, to conduct this research. So we used an online survey, we did key informant interviews, we did an extensive literature review, and also did quite a bit of data mining of financial tracking services to kind of understand how much cash is actually being delivered. And we also worked with the steering committee of our members to kind of validate the report and develop it through the process. Now, I'll just go over some of the main findings. The report is over 100 pages. It's quite long. So I'm just going to give you kind of a quick snapshot of the highlights. So first of all, we found that in 2016, when we last were able to collect data, $2.8 billion was spent on cash transfer programming. This is an increase of 40% from the year before that and double the year before that. So we do see a strong trend of growth for cash programming. On the flip side, though, we see that only two agencies, UNHCR and WFP, are implementing 2/3 of the cash transfer programming globally. So growth is pretty uneven, and it also indicates that there might be ways that responses are also changing as well with the growth of cash. Overall, cash is making up 10% of global humanitarian assistance. So it is definitely becoming a regular tool in the humanitarian toolbox. So that is quite positive. The most significant barrier identified by the community has been around capacity. This goes both to human resources capacity, as well as the policies and systems within organizations to really take cash into consideration as a response option on equal footing as other modalities. So that's been a real challenge. We have made gains in this area. CALP has done a number of trainings for the humanitarian community on cash, but we still definitely have gaps when it comes to non-programmatic staff, particularly those working in logistics, finance, and administrative issues. So we have some work to do there. We also have pretty major gaps when it comes to local organizations and national authorities, too. So we are trying to make more effort there. Now, we highlight a number of the critical debates in cash. There are about 6, ranging from social protection to financial inclusion, areas where we're kind of not clear where we're headed. But I wanted to highlight in particular the tension around multi-purpose cash grants. So initially, I think in the debates around cash, the choices or options were around in-kind or cash. Now, as you know, we've found, we've built the case for the use of cash as a more efficient and effective modality. We're seeing that debate shift between multi-sector and sector-specific cash grants. And I think that's been built around some of the perceptions that some donors certainly have framed cash a bit as kind of a panacea for meeting all humanitarian needs, when we do know quite widely that that is not the case. But I think there's been some kind of miscommunication around that issue. We do know that cash is very good at addressing financial barriers, so when goods and services are available, then it's very effective in doing that. But we also know that when it comes to maybe more technical and quality outcomes, say around regaining shelter in a disaster-prone area, or in a country where legal frameworks are weak, limited, non-existent, that other types of assistance are definitely needed to make sure people have a real future as well. And these tensions, though, have led to quite a bit of defensiveness and a number of tensions across the humanitarian community. And we've seen this quite a lot around when it comes to coordination at the field level. So right now, coordination around cash has been done kind of at the intersector or intercluster level. But we have still seen a major lack in the quality of cash coordination, both technically and strategically. And certainly, I think putting certain actors in certain sectors on the defensive has not helped for greater collaboration. And this is especially key when it comes to multi-purpose cash, because we need joint multi-sectoral assessments, we need joint monitoring, we need to develop our transfer values and programming in sync and together. So if this is not managed well, this is a pretty significant threat to making the best use of cash. Now, I'll just close kind of to talk about what CALP is doing to address some of these challenges. So we have a small team of 3 here in the US, very energetic, and we also have about 20 more staff globally. And one of our key priorities and one of the value adds of CALP is really to provide that neutral platform and where we can bring our diverse stakeholders together. So CALP members, we have 70 plus national and international NGOs, we have private sector actors, UN agencies, donors, et cetera. So it's a great chance for us to bring people together to talk through some of these difficult issues and build trust. Secondly, we're doing a lot of training. So we have face-to-face trainings, training of trainers. We have a number here in DC, so check our website if you're interested in joining us this summer. We also have all the training materials online as well, so if your organizations want to do more capacity building internally, you can take that on as well. So please just let us know. We're also looking to strengthen the evidence base around cash. So we're mapping evidence, identifying gaps, and working with our stakeholders to identify research priorities, kind of what's next to take cash further. We're also doing some research ourselves around risk, as that has been identified as a particular challenge in scaling up cash programming. And we're also doing mapping of cash against different sectoral outcomes with global clusters as well. So finally, there aren't major policy hurdles to doing more cash at this point. But our bigger challenge right now is to put our ideals into action. And this is bringing us into, maybe an area where we're a bit more uncomfortable, but this is also the time where we really need to be working together to collaborate and innovate to make the best use of cash programming.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. I'll turn next to Danielle, but before I do, just a reminder, as you can see on the screen behind us and over on the side of the room, we encourage you to be tweeting and getting on social media, talking about what's being said here. Just use the hashtag CGD Talks, and if you have a particularly trenchant tweet, we may just retweet it. Turn next to Danielle Mouton-Smith to give some of the USAID perspective.
Great, thank you. And thanks for hosting this conversation this morning, and thank you for the report. We find the report to be very timely and very helpful in actually looking at how we are as a community also meeting the grand bargain commitments around cash, because not only did we commit to increasing the level of cash programming where we can, but we also agreed kind of as a global community to look at best practices, challenges, how do we better coordinate, and I think this report does a very good job of pointing to a lot of those areas that we need to focus and helps us, I think, more broadly than just increasing the value of cash, but also addressing some of those issues that we need to and we committed to in the grand bargain. So I think it's a very good contribution to the global community and kind of our work in this area. For those of you who don't know the USAID humanitarian system very well, we're kind of bifurcated at USAID a bit. We have 2 offices that do humanitarian assistance. Food for Peace, which does the food assistance side of responses, and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which does the non-food side. And then over at State Department, we have our colleagues in PRM that work on the refugee response side. So all together, we kind of cohesively work to try to respond to the emergencies in the world. And one of the challenges that we've had in Food for Peace is that 8 years ago, all of our aid was tied to US in kind. And so really for us, kind of moving into cash has really accelerated over the past several years and been a big growth and learning area for us in terms of increasing our responses and changing how we do things. Beginning in 2010, we started to receive international disaster assistance in addition to our Title II funding, which we can use to provide cash transfers, vouchers, buy locally, regionally, and internationally as well. So we use that in conjunction with our in-kind. And for many years, our in-kind, our US in-kind side, greatly kind of outweighed how much we had on the flexible cash side. And last year, or in 2016, 2017, we kind of saw an evening out of our emergency resources. So we had about the same for both our cash and our in-kind side. So part of our ability to increase our cash programming is tied to authorities and budget, but we're making a lot of progress in that area. And I think the administration over the last couple of years has put a priority on asking for funds in those accounts that are most flexible. So this has been, I think, a bit controversial, but there hasn't been a request on the Title II side in the 17 and 18 budgets, and I'm sorry, in the 18 and 19 budgets, and an increase in the International Disaster Assistance account, where we can use that to buy in the U.S. if we need to, as well as internationally and provide it for these other purposes. So you can see that focus on using the most effective tools and responding with the right tool at the right time. The amount of cash that Food for Peace has been using to respond to food crisis has been steadily increasing over the past several years. In FY15, we provided about $126 million in cash programming, and last year we did $317 million. So this seems like almost a doubling, but in perspective, a lot of it actually is the growth in the humanitarian assistance budgets as well. So proportionally, it wasn't quite as big a jump, but we are doing quite a significant amount. With vouchers last year, that totaled $735 million. So again, a large contribution to this specific area. Since our funding and our authorities are kind of split, and we do have our in-kind and we do have our flexible funding, we do kind of apply kind of a decision tree in how we're looking at things. And this is something that we designed jointly with OFDA and PRM. So we're all kind of using the same tool to look at how we're approaching problems. And we're considering things like appropriateness, feasibility, the objective, and cost. Lynn mentioned kind of the technical areas. If there's a real nutrition issue we're trying to focus on, or a health issue, we might look at that in terms of the objective of the response and what tools we're going to use. And what we find is we're actually often using mixed modalities as well. So cash might be a great way to address 3 problems, but the 4th and 5th, we need a different targeted response in certain areas. So we're really kind of trying to apply that thinking, looking at kind of market analysis, making sure that if we're giving people cash, they have the markets to get what they need. And I think that's an important piece of responsibility on us as kind of humanitarians to make sure that we're still providing for the needs. So if it's cash and people are going to buy what they want and buy what they need, just making sure that they have access to those markets and access to those tools. So we have a great markets team in Food for Peace that is working with our partners, and we ask for kind of market analysis just to make sure, again, that cash is the right tool. I just wanted to give a couple of examples where we've seen cash. I mean, for us, really the growth of cash came in the Syria regional response. Responding in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey in kind was not an option. Logistically, it would have been highly problematic. You had millions of refugees dispersed in urban areas and across countries. There were security issues that we considered in terms of having people come and line up to receive general distribution of commodities, and you had highly sophisticated markets where we didn't want to disrupt those markets by bringing in-kind commodities from the US or elsewhere. So we really kind of approached it as what is the best tool here, and I think the voucher and cash system really was tried and scaled up in this response, and where we as Food for Peace and I think USAID saw our kind of contribution here. Really, this is where we tested it out and really kind of helped bring it to scale. We started with a voucher program kind of tied very much to grocery stores, where people could get like a debit card and they could go in and they could buy in a certain set of markets. It is evolving as time has gone on. We're now using something called Choice in parts of Jordan, more cash transfer programming in Lebanon. One of the things, I was in Jordan about 1.5 years ago, and people really liked the voucher system, but some people, for example, with small kids or so on, complained about having to go all the way to the supermarkets that were part of the voucher system versus the local corner store or the local market that was easier for them to get to. So by having the choice, by having the cash and not having it tied to a specific chain of grocery stores, they have more flexibility. They can go to multiple markets to get what they want. And so there's this connection to kind of dietary diversity and so on that we're seeing as well with the increase of cash in that area. We're also using cash in a lot of other emergencies. In Nigeria, for example, and responding to the crisis there, we were using quite a bit of cash transfers to respond to the food security crisis. There is a great example, actually, of a mixed response. Depending upon where we were in the country and what the markets were, we might have been using in-kind, we might have been using vouchers, or we were using cash. And it did kind of change depending upon the situation at hand. And again, there were certain places where we were trying to target nutritional products or a nutritional response, and so we were using in-kind, but also providing cash so that the family could go use the cash to buy what they needed, but we were making sure that the kids under 5 and the moms were getting the nutritious products that they needed as well. So there we're kind of balancing our objectives to the tools that we have. So I think overall we're seeing a lot of evolvement in this area. I think we're seeing a lot of excitement. And we're seeing a lot of kind of progress in how we're using it, and frankly, the kind of the types of proposals and ideas that we're seeing come from our partners as well, and how they're requesting, how they're kind of putting forth their ideas that allows us to kind of provide innovative awards.
Great, thanks for that, Danielle. Rada, IRC has been one of the most vocal proponents of expanding the use of cash transfer programming, and I know that you've been doing some recent lessons learned exercises as you go towards this, as you roll this agenda out within IRC. So we'd love to hear some of that and other lessons that you're taking away from this experience over the last few years.
Great. Okay. So good morning, everybody. Thank you, CGD, for hosting us. And I think it's terrific just to hear the progress that's been made over the last few years. So IRC, as you said, we did make a commitment in 2016 to delivering 25% of our international humanitarian assistance in the form of cash. We have a lean towards unrestricted, we have a lean towards unconditional, and then we will work our way back from there, dependent on context. We also made a commitment to delivering 75% of our cash in our country programs digitally. And so I'll be happy to talk about a little bit of our learning and experience in that process. So we're about midway through our strategy now. And there's a few things that I think are important to share and also maybe build off some of the earlier remarks. So one thing I think is just in terms of the target itself. I remember at the time when we set that target, we sort of wanted to whisper it a little bit, and then somehow it became a big commitment at the World Humanitarian Summit, and we sort of recoiled and thought, oh my God, like now we've really got to do this. And it felt quite intimidating. At that time, we were at 6%, just 6.5%. Which was pretty standard for where the humanitarian system was at that time. Obviously, there's been growth since then. At the end of the last fiscal year, we measured again, and we're at about 17.5%, right? So suddenly, 25% didn't seem so far away. And I think what this speaks to is a couple things. One, I think that there is the excitement or the potential of cash almost is in that kind of laying the gauntlet down, right? Like that there is the potential for us to simplify how the humanitarian system works, how we deliver aid to people, and we can go out and throw it out there as a goal and as a North Star for us all to drive towards. So there's an inspiring and aspirational focus that people can rally around, and we found organizationally that having just a metric, doesn't matter what the metric is, was really valuable. They understood from board through CEO down to 200 field offices across 30 country programs. Okay, this is what we're all working towards. So I think just having clarity and simplicity in a target was really valuable. I think the question that it's raised for us as we've made progress towards achieving that volume target is about the denominator, right? So we're thinking it's 25% of our international humanitarian assistance. We've thought about it. I think it sounds a little bit similar to how Food for Peace has been thinking about it. in terms of the denominator is of the things that we can give people, right? It's the things, it's the food, it's the non-food items, it's the stuff that we can give people. And as we've made progress towards this, towards the 25% goal, and we're seeing, actually, this seems pretty achievable, we're now questioning whether that's the right denominator. You know, is there a more transformative role for cash to play, where it's not just about replacing or displacing or combining in whatever way with in-kind support, but is it instead also an opportunity for us to think about what else money can solve, right? It's not, we fully agree, money can't solve everything, but there's many more things that it potentially could, and we don't know yet. So that's kind of an internal conversation that's ongoing that we're having across sectors within IRC. I think to Lynn's point about the defensiveness, right? This is I think with any kind of shift that we're trying to produce, there is a resistance, you know, and a preference to stick to what we know, right? Let's make change, but can we make it incremental rather than big leaps? And there is a defensiveness that can emerge, or and tensions that can emerge. We found that in the way that we've been pushing forward with cash, the way that we've tried to have those internal conversations, whether it's with our health colleagues, our protection colleagues, our education colleagues, is to not say, you know, we think cash can solve many of the things that you're already working on, let's cancel that and replace it. We've instead approached it with a very strong view on evidence. So we've said, you know, organizationally, we set out a policy internally to take a cash-first approach for outcomes that we know there is sufficient evidence to show that it's effective. So for us, that was in terms of basic needs, in terms of certain food security outcomes. What we also said is that there is suggestive evidence right now that there are certain health outcomes that can be supported more effectively, potentially through cash. Also some protection outcomes that may be, but we're not sure. The evidence isn't strong enough yet. So what we would like to do in partnership with our colleagues is lay out a research agenda and pursue that. So success, in a way, for us is not only thinking about the increased use of cash across outcomes, but it's also the increased investment in research for how cash can be used across different outcomes. And that's helped almost take away some of that, some of the defensiveness, because we're going to let the evidence speak for itself, right? So that's been a way to kind of neutralize some of that potential for tension. A couple of other things that I would know is just in terms of one of the big lessons that we've had has been just about how we're able to deliver. So there's certainly capacity issues, there's certainly internal policy procedural issues. We've spent a lot of time revising the way that we do financial accounting. So really getting into the underbelly of the organization and understanding how are different account codes charged, how do those get tracked through our finance systems, so that we can actually track what we're doing. We've also tried to simplify. So in the absence of capacity, can we simplify our processes and procedures in as much as possible? So working very closely with our supply chain and finance colleagues to essentially set up, one of the things that we've set up is kind of standard operating procedures for any different kind of payment mechanism. And what this has done is that it's been vetted by our ethics and compliance unit, it's been vetted by our finance and our supply chain units. So essentially in a template, there's 60% of it that has been vetted and that is not allowed to be changed. And then there's 40% that the country teams and the field teams are allowed to add to and amend. And so what that has done is, from the field perspective, they're thrilled because now it can reduce the amount of time that it takes to get things approved, because it doesn't need to go through all of these additional layers of bureaucracy within the organization. And it makes us, from a headquarters perspective, feel more secure, because now we only know that there's 40% that can be shifted. And so that's a much easier part of the process for us to monitor when we're laying this out. So I think combining that view to policy and procedure as well as capacity has been helpful. But I would say one of the things that we are continuing to push on is that we know that for us to be able to deliver cash effectively, what we do internally is only one half of the challenge, and the other challenge is on the infrastructure that we have available to us externally. Right, so we did a piece of research a couple of years ago around digital financial infrastructure, with this view to, if we want to be able to deliver more cash through digital means, then is the infrastructure actually available in the places where we need it to be in order to deliver? Our field teams were telling us, like, we don't need this research, it's not there, we can tell you that. And we nonetheless decided to document it, and did find that, in terms of where there is the infrastructure, it's really only available, digital infrastructure is really only available in the way that we need it in 30% of the highest humanitarian risk areas. So as we're trying to push for this more efficient way of delivering, a more secure way of delivering, we're also facing this really tough external reality, which is just an absence of infrastructure for us to use. And so part of our strategy has really been focused not only on pushing our internal processes, but also using as many external advocacy and policy reform opportunities to drive investment towards high-risk humanitarian areas, so that we're not just seeing these great new financial products emerging in Jordan, but we are seeing them in Northeast Nigeria. We are seeing them in Yemen. And there is an increasing appetite in that, but we've felt that leaning into that has also been really critical for us to be able to deliver on our target, but also then see a larger response from the sector as a whole.
That's a fascinating point to end on. So I'm going to ask one round of questions, and then we'll open it up, and we'll try to leave about half an hour for audience engagement. So I want to maybe go first to Lynn. So Lynn, you talked about some of the tensions and defensiveness that are emerging as cash scales up. I'd love to delve into that a little bit more. One of the really interesting dynamics, and we've seen this playing out over the past couple of years in particularly Lebanon and Turkey, is there are some donors that are very, very forward-leaning on the use of multi-purpose cash, aren't especially particular about who delivers that, as long as they're getting good value for money and how it's delivered, and have been kind of roiling the system a bit because they are pushing so hard for this. And I don't think it's any secret to folks in this room that we're talking about DFID and the EU. I'm interested in how CALP's members, who would comprise most of the organizations that have a stake in this, are thinking about that. And where should the sector be headed in terms of how we resolve that? Should we be segmenting cash programming along the lines of the traditional institutional divisions in the sector? And if we shouldn't, how do we reconcile that with the way the money has traditionally flowed?
Yeah, a very difficult question, one that's weighing on the minds of many of our members these days. As you mentioned, DFID and ECHO, I think, have been pushing more for the use of a single delivery mechanism, and also separating out the delivery function from the assessment and design of programming, as well as from the monitoring. So having different entities do those three different parts that typically has been done by one entity, an implementing organization. And I think ECHO right now is conducting a market assessment to see if it's possible even for one kind of delivery system to be used globally. So it is still, I would say, early days. I think one lesson from what happened in Lebanon, I think it's been about a bit over a year now, is that there was a realization that a lot of progress had been made, and that there was the donors kind of came together for an extra push to try to work towards this single system. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of back and forth between the major players, particularly UNHCR and WFP, as well as some of the NGOs. But the DFID and ECHO didn't really get what they want in the end. And I think that there was a recognition as well that there needed to be greater consultation as well, and an understanding of kind of where these agencies were coming from. This was a challenge to various protocols when it comes to data sharing, when it comes to the use of various systems. There's a lot of nitty-gritty details that maybe aren't that sexy, but they can really challenge this integration. So there's a number of things that I think we need to work on, and I know that there's an NGO platform, the Collaborative Cash Delivery Platform, the CCD, that is trying to look at how can, among some of the NGOs, can we come together and look at our legal protocols and bring our general counsels together to try to iron out these details. What can we share without compromising data protection or protection of beneficiaries? So it is a big one, and I think it's going to be taking time. But I also think that this is, again, where we do need to come together. We need to talk things out. We need to hash a lot of it out, and it's not going to be easy.
Is that not happening?
Either. I think it is, and it is, but it will also need time, also, because we're talking about programs that are going to be also perhaps bigger in scale. Another area that we're working on from CALP is looking at different operational models, and we've developed a framework to analyze the different drivers of efficiency and effectiveness. So I think that will also help to feed the discussions and build the evidence base for actually what does create more efficient and effective systems for cash programming, and according to our different multi-sectoral objectives.
Great. Danielle, between ECHO, DFID, and the U.S., you've got, off the top of my head, about two-thirds to three-quarters of global institutional humanitarian financing. So whichever way, if those three donors align around something, it sets the terms pretty concretely for much of the rest of the sector. So where is the U.S. government on this these days, and particularly with respect to this push for multi-purpose cash? How is the U.S. government thinking about that, and how do some of the proposed changes and reforms within USAID in terms of merging the often Food for Peace offices start to potentially change what's possible on that front?
So I think multi-purpose cash has been a bit trickier for us, given the bifurcation of our offices, for example, at USAID. So when you have one office working on food and one office working on non-food, and our money is kind of given to us with those restrictions on it, in a sense, it makes it really hard for either of us to really move into multi-purpose cash. And so we have looked at how do we come together, because often in a place we might be responding in the same area and even with the same partners, and we may both be doing cash. So could we come together and do a joint award, for example? So we look at kind of the needs assessment, or kind of look at what the sector needs are, and so we might say, okay, well, food is making up 70% of the needs here, so we'll kind of fund 70% of this award from Food for Peace aside, and the shelter and the other needs are about 30%, so OFTA funds that. So that might be one way we would approach it, kind of looking at the sector needs and kind of just making an assumption based on that in terms of the breakdown between our offices. So we've done that in a lot of cases. But we are also looking at how do we do more of multi-purpose cash, and again, it does get tricky. And I think some of the redesign conversations that have been happening within USAID do lend itself more to evolving in this area. So as Jeremy was saying, for those who don't know, there is kind of this transition redesign plan going on within USAID. And one of the ideas that's been proposed is the creation of a Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, which would bring together OFTA, and Food for Peace. And in doing so, kind of break down some of those walls in terms of who's responding to what sector. And so we do see a lot of potential here in terms of multi-purpose cash, in terms of bringing together our responses in a more efficient and effective way for both our partners who maybe don't have to apply for 2 awards, and as well as for the beneficiaries on the end delivery in terms of having one transfer or so on. So we do kind of see a lot of potential there. Before that, I think we're both kind of looking. OFTA has put out some new guidelines this year around including multi-purpose cash as part of their awards. We're looking at something similar of can we move into this area a bit more ahead of kind of the full coming together. It does get a bit tricky, again, as I said, because of authorities and budget, but we are trying to explore ways of making it more effective within our agencies of doing this.
Great. Radha, you talked a lot about how IRC is trying to take an evidence-driven approach to this and go where the evidence leads you. And also the fact that the evidence agenda is still inadequate or insufficient relative to some of these bigger questions that we're now tackling. And I thought the framing of what's the denominator? Is cash just a substitute for traditional in-kind programming, or does it change how we should think about programming? What kind of evidence agenda do we need to answer that kind of a question? What kind of an evidence agenda do we need to get at and help us think through some of these questions around, should cash be segmented by sector, or should it transcend some of the sectoral or institutional divisions that we've usually, for a long time used within the humanitarian sector to order how we deliver aid?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there are a few areas for us to focus on. So I would say there's a few different buckets. There's a bucket that looks at that is still needed in terms of just formative research. We need to understand better the experiences of people who are receiving cash, how they are using it, how they are, what their preferences are, what that looks like at different stages of displacement in different countries or regions, what kinds of disasters. There's a lot that we just need to understand that is missing right now. So I'd say that's one bucket. There's another bucket that's about effectiveness. So what is the impact that providing someone with a cash transfer can have? And there's a whole host of questions within that about different outcomes. It's also about what are the different, is it large lump sums? Is it smaller monthly transfers? There's a whole host of questions that need to be played with and experimented with so that we can get a better understanding there. There's a third bucket, I would say, and I would say the third and fourth bucket are probably a bit tied. There's a third bucket that's really about cost effectiveness, right? So once we understand what cash could do from an impact perspective, we need to be able to compare that a little bit and say, is this an effective way, or is it as effective as delivering other interventions from a cost perspective? And then I would say the last area, and this is the one that I feel like needs a little bit more thought and is not totally clear yet, is just how we take potentially that combination of impact evidence and cost effectiveness evidence so that we can start benchmarking, right? And I think that there's a whole opportunity there for us to understand not just is it more effective to buy things for people and give it to them or have them buy it themselves, but is it more effective when we're thinking about delivering support services, right? Like when we look at IRC's budget, so much of our budget is in programmatic staffing costs because so many of the services are about providing case management, providing training that's delivered by people. Those are expensive costs. And I think the challenge is for us, and I think this is where it's, we haven't landed anywhere on this yet. This is still a live conversation for us, is how can we benchmark those things
Right.
against each other? So is
Right.
it better? And in a way, I think what's exciting is that it potentially challenges us to say, okay, we do know that actually case management is really critical to people. You know, having that level of attention is really critical. But if we know that it's also costly, and we know that there's, you know, an alternative is just money that's provided, then maybe it will spur us to think about how we deliver that case management slightly differently. And I use case management as an example. I have nothing against case management. But I think there is something for us to also consider in terms of just how we might benchmark so that we can really make sure that anywhere that we're delivering assistance, the people who are receiving it are getting the best thing that we could be offering.
Right. And I think that's really, this set of answers starts to get to why cash is so potentially fundamentally transformative. If you, when you mentioned DFID and ECHO are approaching multi-purpose cash in a way now that tries to separate the needs analysis and the targeting and the understanding from the delivery, from the evaluation, I mean, that alone is a major departure from the traditional business model in the sector, where all of those functions would be encapsulated within, you know, for each sector within a single UN agency. So if you start breaking those apart, that poses some really interesting challenges to the financial models of the agencies. What you're talking about, Radha, if the evidence tells us that the most effective way to deliver cash is not along the lines of this sector or this institution or that institution, but something that straddles or transcends those, then that starts to challenge the conceptual foundations of some of these agencies and dividing lines too. And so, you know, we're far away yet from fully seeing where that's going to take us, but I think it begins to point to why this sector holds such transformative and disruptive potential, and also gets to why that needs to be managed fairly carefully and judiciously. I'd like to open it up to the audience now, and I have more questions for the panel, but I'm sure you do too. So we got some mics, so why don't we go first here? We'll take three at a time. Here, and there.
Hi, thank you for all your comments. I'm Kathleen Callaghan. I'm from the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves at the UN Foundation. We're funding two projects in Ethiopia and Rwanda right now, both of which depend on the UNHCR country offices launching a cash-based programming in the relevant camps. And it's proving a little challenging in one case because it's new territory for them, and in the other case because there was some internal resistance that was slowing the process down. So my question, either for Danielle or Lynn, is have you guys reached a point where you have developed a decision tree or similar mechanism that you can give to organizations to ask the right questions about if you've decided that cash is the answer, you know, is it single purpose, multi-purpose, is it voucher, is it a card, like what conditions should decide that? And then Radha, have you encountered any situations where cash was considered to be a protection risk versus something that increased protection?
That's a really interesting question. We had one over here.
Yes, my name is Frei Rojas from Rutgers University. First of all, thanks to the Center for Global Development for this interesting discussion, and thanks all of you for the support on behalf of humanitarian aid. Syria gets the spotlight for obvious reasons. My question is more related to some specific case, Venezuela. Venezuelans are facing a humanitarian crisis. What are the symptoms are malnutrition, malnourished children, and a heavy migration to local neighbor countries like Chile, Peru, and Colombia. My question is, what are your institutions doing in terms of regarding the Venezuelan case? Thank you in advance.
Great question. And I think we had one more back here, Mike. And we'll take another round after this.
Okay. Thanks. Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a fellow at CGD. So kind of to Lynn's, it's a question for everyone, but to Lynn's point of there being no policy hurdles. So there is kind of a work stream going on between the World Bank and Charity and Security on this issue of de-risking, which is a kind of boring idea of like banks not being willing to enter into certain countries, particularly through correspondent relationships, when they're worried about the money laundering and terrorism financing risk. And And some of the nonprofits in that group, and they're very large organizations, have said, we're under pressure to do more cash, but also the banks are telling us they don't want to do cash in some of these regions. And I want to get a sense from you in how narrow or wide this problem is and potential solutions to the issue.
Great question. All right, so I'll turn back over to the panelists, and then we'll take another round. I think we'll have time. We can go to 11. So maybe we'll go in reverse order here. Radha, take any of those, but I think I'm struck by the parallel between what Mike is talking about with the bank de-risking and what you identified as the supportive wraparound technical architecture that may or may not exist in high-risk environments.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there is it is a concern. I mean, I think your diagnosis is spot on. I think there is movement to have more flexible regulatory conditions for financial institutions in a number of places. I think. This is still, the G20 last year had a work stream that the German presidency was leading on financial inclusion for forcibly displaced people. And I have to say that it was really, really kind of inspiring in a kind of out-of-body experience way, sitting in a room with a lot of financial regulators talking about how they wanted to, or how they felt that they could adjust the regulations in country to serve displaced populations. I mean, that is not a conversation that you would have had with that crew of people, 5 years ago. So there has been increasing recognition of the need for regulatory adjustments to be able to deal with large-scale humanitarian crises. The roadmap for how that's done is still very uncharted. That we have a few examples. We have a few examples from different places where progress has been made, and it's been very kind of pro-humanitarian, pro-displaced populations, I would say. But those are just case studies at this stage. We don't have regional regulatory frameworks to help cross-border movements. And I think that now with the G20, thankfully, is continuing that roadmap development under the Argentinian presidency. And I think that it'll be a great opportunity. There's been a lot of buy-in from member states. And so I'm very optimistic that the recommendations that came out of last year's work will continue for next year. But I think there's a lot of both, I think there's political, policymaker, and donor buy-in to that as an agenda. So while the challenges are there, I think they're also recognized and have been diagnosed, and there is effort to try and address them. So it's a positive trend, at least.
Yeah. Cash as a protection risk?
Oh yeah. Okay. So definitely, yeah. There's certainly places where you shouldn't be doing cash, and we've had. I think the run of questions, right? As I said, we will encourage doing cash. We will encourage being as limited in terms of restrictions and conditions in doing that. But the big factors for consideration in doing that are context, our security, protection risks, and markets, right? So that there's no point doing this if people don't have access to the markets. Where they need to be able to buy the commodities that they're interested in. So yeah, an example, we had interest from our team in Central African Republic, and they were very keen to look at, could we do cash? And at the time, it wasn't sensible, it wasn't advised because of security conditions. So we would say in that context, no. In terms of protection, the different levels of protection risk, that's a bigger kind of security environment, security context issue. The protection risk that we're looking at in terms of intra-household issues that may arise, where is it safer to give money to men or to women? Are there certain kinds of modalities that are safer? Is electronic really more safe than physical cash? We think yes on that last question. But there is a whole body of evidence that still needs to be generated. So we have several studies going on that are looking at intimate partner violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, so engagement of young girls and women in particular in sex work. So there's a number of different areas that we're still exploring and trying to get a better handle on. But certainly there are questions, good questions to ask there, and so we're just still trying to gather more evidence on what those experiences are.
Great. Danielle, and you say it's been talking a lot about Venezuela lately. Curious what your plans are there and whether cash factors into that.
I had a feeling I was going to get this question, and it's a good question, and I think it's one where I think data plays into a lot of what we're lacking right now in Venezuela. So we've been responding to Colombia and Ecuador kind of issues there for some time, and we've been using cash because again markets are good, and it's a good tool there. And we've actually transitioned some of our programs from in-kind to cash in both those countries, and now we're starting to see kind of these migrant flows and trying to figure out how best to. And there's political issues there as well, what the governments in Colombia and other places are kind of willing to accept and kind of how we're able to term things and so on. So it's a tricky political situation right now, which I think will change rapidly over the next several months. The inside Venezuela issue is one, I think, right now where we are lacking data. And it's going to make figuring out how the international community can respond tricky. To be able to know kind of what the market situations are. We have information that's kind of coming out through different channels, but it's not necessarily the concrete data that we would like to see. You don't have as many partners operating inside Venezuela, so there's a capacity issue as well. For example, the World Food Program isn't inside, UNICEF is. So we're looking at exploring kind of who's there, what capacities do they have, and kind of what are the best options for kind of a response inside Venezuela. So I think that a lot of it is kind of trying to weigh the different options with the information and the limited information we do have, and expecting that over time as the situation changes, the responses will probably change as well. If we figure out what's happening more clearly, we get more information, if more people are allowed in, and so on. So I think it's one where I would say we're looking very closely at options, and I think we're talking to a lot of people and trying to make those determinations. And I think the partner capacity issue may be a big one there right now, and again it may change rapidly. So we'll see.
I might just add on to the question around de-risking. So there's a lot of activity, I think, happening at kind of a higher level. But I think what we've heard also from KELP members is there are a lot of opportunities kind of for local negotiations with financial service providers and authorities to try to allow for different workarounds, for example. So for example, like this hasn't happened, we don't have success yet, but with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, a survey showed that 85% of refugees noted cash as their top need. But there's been definitely concerns from the government and then consequently from financial service providers on actually allowing that to happen. But there are, I think, discussions happening between coordination mechanisms to try to advocate for the use there. And there are other examples too where we've been able to find some other solutions to the know your client regulations among banks. Just in response to your question about some potential tools, I think the key issue there is to conduct response analysis, and this is generally across any type of program that you would want to do. So in KELP's tools, we do have some work done on response analysis, and we've just completed also kind of a revised training or curriculum on how to conduct that. So it can be a bit more complicated, of course, than But the decision tree also, and I think the U.S. government's modality tools also been really helpful and a very kind of simplified, streamlined tool to use.
Great. And an interesting reminder as well on your earlier point, the obstacles we're facing here are not just technical, they're often political.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a couple more questions. I think we had one there, and there. We've got a lot of questions. So I'll take 3 more. We can probably do one more round after this if you guys are quick.
Hi, my name is Juliana Rubio. I work with Fundación Capital. I'm currently based in Colombia right now, and we mostly work on promoting global citizenship at scale. And my question was regarding the end users. We haven't really talked about what has been done as far as education for those cash transfer recipients, both in terms of basic money management skills, such as budgeting, saving, and also in terms of technical skills. Anything from knowing how to use the mobile phone for their cash transfer, or even going into a bank or using an ATM.
That's great. And then right there.
Hey, I'm Dave. Just kind of wanted to piggyback on this fellow's question. But instead of looking at the donor or international regulations, curious about the transfer mechanisms and local regulations and how we're considering the way in which we interact with the governments where we're working. Since most transfer mechanisms, whether that's bank cards, mobile money, an existing bank, another transfer institution, how we are looking at those across the board.
Right. And here.
Thank you. My name is Ulrich Manns, working for the European Union here in DC. Thanks, Jeremy, for organizing this great panel. European Union, Lynn's mentioned it, is doing a market study at the moment, and you'll be hearing more from us as soon as that's done. One question sort of struck me. We're talking in this panel particularly on the current systems, how they're in place, and how multi-cash or cash systems can be inserted in these systems. As part of the work that we're doing at the European Union is looking ahead and how these systems will look different, not only because we insert cash or we don't, but also because it becomes more digital. The whole technologies that come with it and can be used, whether it's the financial sector or others, are shaping and reshaping the way we work in these environments. Question to, I think, pretty much all of you is, what are the key innovations, technologies that you would point out you might be doing research already on, also as an invitation to sort of, keep the channel open, because we're basically looking at that as well going forward. Thank you.
Great. So let's take that round, and we should have time for one more round after that. Right, Lynn?
Sure. I'll just make a comment perhaps on the your question about the end users. And I think pretty much any cash transfer programming in the cash feasibility studies, we would want to make sure that the intended recipients have a basic kind of numeracy and literacy skills to use cash effectively. And also when it comes to different transfer mechanisms, whether it's mobile money or the use of an ATM card, et cetera, often we would do trainings with all the beneficiaries to make sure that they know how to use that. There's usually a complaints hotline as well, so that if there are any problems, lost PIN numbers, et cetera, they can get in contact and find out how they can get that fixed. There can be issues definitely with certain populations. For example, elderly populations might have a harder time and be not as comfortable with some of the technology. So sometimes we will find workarounds for these groups. So that's just a bit of a touch on it. I don't have much to say. I think on the technology side, that's not an area that CALP is. We've left it to our members who are far more sophisticated in that area.
Daniel?
So to answer your question maybe first a little bit, I think we are working and trying to support different initiatives that partners are taking in this area. I mean, we also have So for example, the World Food Program has been working on developing kind of their cash monitoring, their cash delivery systems, and so on. And we've been trying to support that through different contributions. We feel that the better that, in a sense, they can deliver the assistance, the better it is that our funding is being used more effectively and so on. So we've been kind of trying to make some targeted contributions in some of these areas with different partners who have new ideas. We also have something called the Global Development Lab within USAID, and they have been doing a lot of research on digitization and electronic transfers. And we've been partnering with them and piloting some different some different work in countries, kind of using joint funding and trying to see how things might work on the ground. I think we've found, as you were saying earlier, that we are challenged in a lot of places where, frankly, the infrastructure doesn't exist. And so we're trying to figure out how do we overcome that. And if you are working in an area where, for example, they don't have good mobile technology or they don't have a good banking system or so on, what are the different types of ways that we can deliver that aid without having necessarily to build an entire system? Because that is a question I've been asked before is, who's supposed to pay for the development of this technology in a country? Is it the humanitarians? Is it the development? Should it be jointly with the government? Maybe all of the above. So kind of looking at kind of what are the ways that we can deliver aid most effectively and trying to work at kind of try different pilot programs with our development lab who have a lot of experience and are looking to partner with the private sector in different areas. And we actually just did a grand challenge on humanitarian issues with DFID and with the Canadians around kind of delivery of humanitarian assistance as well, trying to spark some innovation, trying to spark some private sector interest as well. So we're looking for different things to try and do. We're not necessarily the most cutting edge people ourselves, but I think we rely a lot on our partners and the people in the field to do it. So I just wanted to comment just quickly on what he said as well over there, not from a technical perspective because I don't have a technical, but I think the political point that you maybe are bringing up as well, just to kind of say, I think when we are considering our modalities, we want to do what's best for the beneficiaries, but these political layers do come in. And as you note, a lot of banks and so on are connected to financial regulations. We've had issues in countries like the DRC before. We were trying to set up cash transfer programming where the regulations around banking and stuff really got in the way of us being able to do what we wanted to do quickly. And so we had to kind of have mitigating programs until we were able to figure out how to get over that hurdle, that kind of regulatory hurdle. And there's also a lot, I think, concerns often from governments at Lebanon. We saw this early on. They've changed since then. But in terms of kind of cash coming in, how it might upset the balance between host communities and refugee populations or IDP populations when they've moved into a different part of the country. And if they're seen as getting cash, but the rest of the community isn't, how that might disrupt the balance. I think governments are very sensitive to those issues as well. And so sometimes they might see in kind as like, oh, well, they're just getting a bag of food. It will be seen as less valuable than cash or something like that. So sometimes those types of political barriers come up and governments can find ways to kind of block or paralyze these programs a bit in the short term. Usually we're able to find ways around it, but it can take some time.
The point you make, Danielle, on the who pays for the underlying enabling infrastructure is a really, really interesting one, and it makes me think back to something we found when USAID was organizing the Ebola response in West Africa, that there was not good internet connectivity throughout much of those three countries, and so we were paying through our partners thousands, probably tens of thousands of dollars per month on internet connectivity through sat phones and satellite network VSATs and all that. And at one point, someone pointed out to, I think it was someone from the lab, pointed out to us that you could have nearly set up an entire permanent infrastructure in those three countries for what you're paying on in monthly one-off costs that evaporate at the end of the month. So I think some potential for new thinking there.
And for us to slow down the response originally in the Ebola too, in terms we had the intention of doing cash transfers, but because we didn't have the platforms, had to go with other options until we could get it going. So it also was a hurdle in terms of timing.
Exactly. Radha, what have IRC's experiences been with this question on some of the local regulations and local political factors and how those vary from country to country?
So I think, so again, it's layered. So I would say, the questions are The questions for cash, I wouldn't say are necessarily that different to the questions more broadly in terms of our engagement in countries. So, I would say it's the same in education. How much are you going to conform with the existing education system versus set up something parallel? For cash, it's how much are you going to engage with the local safety net or the way that welfare is provided to the poor versus creating a parallel system. So it's not a really that different set of issues, but it is, I think the fact that it's cash, it somehow feels more heightened in certain ways, but the actual issue itself is not necessarily that different. The way that we approach it is pretty much the same that we would in any sector, is to really look at where there are opportunities for contributing, for being complementary to existing systems. So whether it's an income-based system, welfare system, or a subsidy-based system, we would look at that and examine whether that is something that would work in terms of the beneficiaries that we're focusing on, whether that would work for them in terms of accessing services or accessing the goods and services that they need. But it's a negotiation, like with all of these things. It's an ongoing negotiation, and I think as it relates to the government or the local financial institutions, that's certainly the case. I think to the earlier remarks, what we're trying to do, what we need to get better at is, I talked to someone who works in the development sector who said, well, so, there's all of this money that's going into humanitarian settings in the form of cash. So do you have like a visual, do you have like a map of how the money goes? And I was like, we have maybe like 1,500 maps like that. There is no pipeline, right? There's no one pipeline or three pipelines. It's the pipeline looks different in every country for different sectors, for different, for different operations. So I think that, a big challenge for us is how do we, given all of these contextual differences, variations, and sometimes restrictions, how can we still move towards a more consolidated form of delivery that offers both effectiveness and efficiency? On the technology questions, do you mind if I speak to that? Is that okay? I think it's a great question because I think there's a few things. So there is a bit of a lack of infrastructure. To your point, Jeremy, I think that one of the arguments we've been trying to make is, cash, I think previously was seen as this entry point for financial inclusion, right? So if we offer cash with a financial education program, then it might encourage people to then open bank accounts, and then then they won't be unbanked anymore, right? Like that was like the hope that this is the trajectory we've gone. In practice, it doesn't really work in that way because people don't, people might be able to get a money transfer. Doesn't mean to say they have an account that's operational. They may be able to get a bank card also not attached to an account, right? So there is this kind of short-termism in the way that humanitarian cash transfers works that doesn't always lend itself to these longer-term objectives. But the argument that we have tried to make is financial inclusion, investment in financial infrastructure can be a form of humanitarian preparedness, right? So that Liberia example that you're giving, by equipping people with bank accounts, we can get money to them when a disaster hits so much more quickly. So yes, let's pool those resources and try and be more proactive about where we know that there are high-risk populations. Let's, from a development perspective and a humanitarian perspective, make sure those people are included in our strategies. And I think in terms of the innovations that are there, it's still an area to look at. The way that we've structured it for our work is to try and look at it from a global level versus a local level. So yes, we can have our country offices go out and establish financial service provider agreements with whoever they think, whichever kind of payment mechanism works. But in the absence of that, we've also looked at a number of different global master services agreements that would allow us to trigger those from New York, from headquarters. And the question for us really there is measuring performance. So what is the experience of the user in receiving cash by either of those means? Do we actually see an improvement in timeliness? Is our time to delivery reduced? Is our cost reduced through that? So it's certainly an area that we're still looking at, and I'd be happy to share more on some of the research that we've done from different cases.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's take some very quick questions, and then I'll turn it back over to the panelists to give answers and their final closing thoughts. Let's go to Paula here and Paula there.
Thank you very much. Paula Lynch from BRM at State Department. I just want to say that one of our strongest collaborations is with the Office of Food for Peace at USAID on this issue of cash. We've done a lot of meetings together, and we are looking at the issue from the same perspective. So that in answer to your question about the U.S. government's position, it's not just the Food for Peace, but also we're involved. We tend to look at the partners and the way they're approaching cash. And so for ICRC and UNHCR, they're doing very much larger percentages of their programs in cash. But as you mentioned from IRC, sometimes the increase is just the increase in need, not necessarily the percentage. But in any case, it's very much larger. I wanted to say, and if you have a reaction, to me, you can't look at cash by sector, that every sector has certain parts of it that might be useful for cash, but cash itself is not a sector, it's a mechanism. And each sector is going to have certain things that are able to be done through cash, and then other things that will not be able to be done through cash. And I think that makes it extremely tricky to try to figure out what should the answer be. And there I think that what CALP has done in bringing people together and talking about it and going deep on the issues is extremely valuable for all of us. So thank you very much for that. As a final question, I would say none of you has mentioned gender, and I think gender is clearly an issue of a high-risk category, but I think there may be some other aspects of gender that are important to take into account with cash programming, and I haven't heard anybody talking about that. So I just wondered if there's some quick thoughts. That's it.
Stephanie Siegel, I'm with the Office of Food for Peace, and my question is for Lynn. I'm curious if there's been research on whether ultimately procurement will have to be privatized as cash scales up, and then also what cash is doing to the logistics cluster.
And final question over here.
Hi, Alison Himberger from Mercy Corps. My question is around the effectiveness of cash, and we talked about, cost effectiveness and a lot of the research. I like the research agenda you laid out, Radha. And my question is a little bit flipping it on its head. How can we make cash more effective? We've had a lot of conversations around the digital infrastructure and improving the infrastructure to make cash work. And of course, we touched on the issues of market functionality. But so this is actually a question for you, Danielle. When you look across Food for Peace programming, what do you see as the appetite for also funding market support interventions, the types of things that can actually help us when we're dealing with protracted displacements and contexts where we're going to be giving transfers over a long amount of time? We could perhaps move more from in-kind towards cash. And so what do you see as the trend and the types of partnerships and the appetite for that in Food for Peace?
Great. Danielle, maybe give you the first word, then Radha and Lynn. We'll close with you. So,
sure. We've been looking at the cost efficiency issue quite a bit. When we started down this road kind of using more cash, everything was compared to what we could do in-kind. And I think initially we found a lot of cost savings when you're shipping food that you're buying in the US and shipping it overseas versus being able to program locally. You're saving a lot of kind of transaction costs, transportation costs, and so on. I think we've evolved a lot since then. And in part, what we've found is that actually our local and regional procurement can be the most cost effective if we're just looking at numbers versus the cash. And what we're trying to do, we're looking at all of our numbers and where we're using cash versus other forms of assistance and trying to exactly get to kind of the why. And some of our initial, I think, impressions are around some of these infrastructure issues, startup costs, and so on. And that the first year might be more expensive than if you go a couple of years out someplace and you've got kind of the base in line. Also, a lot of these environments are very complex. and costs of commodities could be going up as well. And so if you see kind of the cost of the food going up, then you have to change your transfer value to kind of respond to that. And so that could also be driving up then the cost. So, it might actually wind up being less expensive to kind of give in kind versus cash. And so I think what we've been trying to do is get away from this question of, does it save us the most money to what is the most appropriate or what is the best tool? It's hard because we get a lot of questions about the cost efficiency or the cost effectiveness of it. But we are trying to kind of look at it from that perspective of what is, along our decision tree, the best modality, the best choice for the beneficiaries and for delivering outcomes versus what's the most cost effective, because it sometimes the cheapest isn't the best. A lot of times maybe. That also gets to your second question too, in terms of market interventions. And frankly, on the in-kind side, we've done this before too, where we saw price spikes because of food scarcity. We've been able to bring in-kind food in to kind of help lower market costs and do it in a way that was more targeted towards markets and individual households. But we are, I think, starting to move in this direction more and more. And what we've really been trying to think about is moving from outputs to outcomes. So are we achieving the outcome we're looking at versus kind of making sure that everyone has X, Y, and Z? And so are we seeing the food security of this community get better, of these households get better by delivering cash or vouchers or what have you, versus how many bags of food did we deliver? And I think that shift in kind of how we're thinking about things is really important. But again, it's an evolution, I think, both inside Food for Peace as well as with the rest of the government and Congress too, in terms of changing how we're approaching the problem and the solutions that we're trying to put forward.
Rhoda, IRC does a lot with gender. How are you thinking about your cash work in terms of your gender work, and how do those two interrelate?
So it's very much part of our thinking. So I think in terms of the outcomes that we've been looking at, so there's again a few different levels. So at the programmatic design level, and I would say I don't think this is unique to IRC. I'm looking at Save the Children, Mercy Corps in the room. I'm sure I know use similar approaches. There is deep attention paid to risk analysis during program design. Gender is a part of understanding some of the feasibility questions as well. So, these questions of, are we going to exclude certain vulnerable populations, and gender being one of the lenses that we look at within that by choosing different kinds of modalities, payment mechanisms. So I think that there are the kind of programmatic decisions that are made from a design perspective. And then obviously during implementation, I think one of the best things that Cash could export to other programs is the complaints mechanism. Like this complaints hotline is simple and I think amazing. Like it's fantastic. We don't see enough of people being able to report back, those people have been trying to take a slice off the transfer that I've been receiving, or, I can't, I'm finding, this place is just too far away, like the mobile money agents that we're supposed to work with, they're not showing up when they're supposed to come. And we get that and we can act on it immediately, right? It's a fantastic tool, and having a very gendered focus in that as a feedback mechanism is also incredibly helpful. So I think at the programmatic level, there's a number of things that do take gender considerations on board. But then I think also more broadly, we do have a whole entire research agenda that's dedicated to understanding two things. One, the impacts and effects of cash on protection. So as I said, in terms of IPV, in terms of intimate partner violence, in terms of sexual exploitation and abuse, but then also how to make cash safer. How to make it more safe for men, women, how to make it safer for younger, for elderly, for differently abled. I think, and so that's something that we're also exploring and is an ongoing piece of research right now. So it's definitely there.
I think this point on the complaints mechanism is a fascinating one because it shows the ways cash is shifting power towards the end users, not just in terms of its very nature, but also in some of the program implementation tactics that further reinforce that. I think that's fascinating. Lynn, final thoughts?
Yeah, just to add on to Radha's comment on gender, CALP is, they convened a number of gender actors in East Africa a couple months ago. And I think one of the findings from over 100 participants was that we have a major gap when it comes to understanding gender and applying actually what we already know to be good practice in our cash transfer programming. So there's a strong push now. We have a call for action as well on outlining ways that we can improve gender integration in cash transfer programming, and a number of papers will be coming out from various partners on how we can do better. I also just want to answer your question quickly on the procurement issue. I can't speak to the logistics cluster specifically, but definitely for logisticians across aid agencies, their role is still very critical. I mean, they know markets very well, and that's a key part of cash transfer programming and helping us understand, monitor markets, and help us procure the financial service providers that we need. So they are still quite key. It's maybe just a different, slightly different skill set or upskilling that they might need, and that's why we have developed a specific cash training for kind of operational and logistics staff. So we hope they do take advantage of that. Just a final thought is that, hopefully we have demystified cash a bit more, and now we do really need further kind of integration throughout the system to understand, how it can be used better, more effectively. It's not necessarily about, cash plus programs. Maybe it's about, we have good programs. Is there a way that cash can further enhance the outcomes around that? Perhaps. So I think now is the time we kind of really need to kind of get to work and innovate and tackle that ambitious research agenda as well to learn more.
That's great. Very, very rich, very wide-ranging discussion. I think it underscores how much progress we've made that we can have this kind of a sophisticated discussion now, but also how much work remains to be done to really bring this sector, this area, into its own within the humanitarian field. Just one or two housekeeping items before I let you all go. So CGD will be launching at the end of this month our new program on refugees, migration, and humanitarian policy. So you'll be seeing a lot more events like this one. We're very excited about that and invite you all to join us for the launch event here at the end of the month. We're going to have some great discussants joining us, and please do sign up for the listserv for that as well. The CALP report and several other reports are out on the tables out front. We've got still plenty of food out back. So stick around. Feel free to chat a bit more after this. And please join me in thanking our great presenters for this wonderful discussion.